The loaf broke apart in her hands before she could hide it, and the crack of stale crust against the floorboards was louder than any gunshot in Silver Hollow, Wyoming, that August morning of 1883. Lynn Atoy froze with the broken bread still clutched against her apron, flour dust rising around her ankles like smoke. Behind the counter, the baker's wife had already begun shouting for someone to fetch the marshal, her voice cracking through the thin morning air of the bakery. But it was not the marshal who reached the doorway first. It was a man who had been standing outside tying his horse to the post, a man whose boots hit the wooden steps two at a time before anyone else in the street had even turned to look. His name was Ezra Hollis, and he had ridden into town that morning for nothing more than flour and a length of rope. He had not planned on catching a thief. He had not planned on anything at all, except finishing his errands before the heat pressed down on the valley the way it always did by noon in high summer. Lynn did not run. She could have. The door behind her stood open to the street, and her legs were young enough and desperate enough that she might have made it past the corral before anyone caught her. But 3 days without food does something to a person's legs, and instead of running, she simply stood there, the ruined loaf pressed to her chest like something she was trying to keep alive. "That's her," the baker's wife said, jabbing a flour-white finger toward Lynn. "Caught her red-handed. Same as last week, I'd wager, only I didn't see her then." The bakery had gone quiet except for the hiss of the oven and the low murmur of 2 other customers who had stopped in the doorway to watch. Silver Hollow was not a large town. Word of a public disgrace would reach every household by supper, and Lynn knew this the way she knew the ache in her stomach was not going to leave simply because she wished it would. Ezra looked at her for a long moment. He was not a large man in the way some ranchers grew large from years of heavy labor, but he carried himself with the kind of stillness that made people wait before speaking to him. His hands, when they were not working, hung loose at his sides, calloused across the palms from rope and reins and the handle of a plow he had walked behind more mornings than he could count. "How much is the bread worth?" he asked. The baker's wife blinked at him. "Beg your pardon?" "The loaf. How much?" 10 cents. But that's not the point, mister. She's been at this before. Somebody's got to answer for it." Ezra reached into his coat and set 2 dimes on the counter, the coins ringing dull against the wood. "There. Paid for. Twice over in case there was another one you didn't catch her at." The baker's wife stared at the coins as though they had personally offended her. "You don't know this woman. She's not from here. Nobody knows where she came from or what she's running from." "I know she's hungry," Ezra said. "That's enough for me this morning." He turned to Lynn, and for the first time since the loaf had broken apart in her hands, someone looked at her without judgment sitting behind their eyes. She braced herself anyway. She had learned in the 2 years since she had come west with the railroad crews and then been left behind when the line moved on without her, that kindness in a stranger's face could turn on a single wrong word. "You're coming with me," Ezra said. The words landed in the bakery like a second crack of bread against the floor. Lynn's chin lifted, and something in her eyes went sharp and wary all at once. "I do not belong to you," she said. Her voice carried the shape of an accent worn thin by 2 years among English speakers, but the words themselves were steady, deliberate, chosen with care. "I am not property to be collected." "Didn't say you were." Ezra's jaw worked once before he spoke again. "Said you're coming with me because you look like you haven't eaten proper in a week. And I've got a cabin outside town that needs a woman's hand in it more than it needs another dime spent at the mercantile. You'll cook, you'll keep the place from falling into ruin around me, and you'll eat every day you do it. That's the whole of it." The baker's wife made a small, disapproving sound, but she said nothing further. She had already been paid twice what the bread was worth, and there was no profit left in arguing with a man who settled his debts in coin before anyone else had finished drawing breath to object. Lynn studied him. 2 years on the frontier had taught her to read the difference between a man who wanted a servant and a man who wanted something crueler dressed up in gentler words. Ezra Hollis did not look away from her scrutiny, and he did not soften his offer to make it more palatable. He simply waited, the way a man waits when he has already decided a thing and is only being polite about the asking. "Why," she said finally. It was not really a question of why he would help her. It was a question of what he expected to be owed. "Because a person doesn't steal bread out of meanness," Ezra said. "They steal it out of need, and need's not something a man ought to leave sitting in the street." He picked up his sack of flour from the counter, tucked it under one arm, and looked back at her once more. "Cabin's a half-hour ride. You can walk beside the horse or ride behind me. Either way, there's a plate waiting when we get there." She followed him out into the white glare of the street. The ride out to Ezra's homestead took them past the last scattered buildings of Silver Hollow and into open country where the grass had gone the color of old rope under the summer sun. Lynn walked at first, refusing his offer to ride, until the heat and the emptiness of her stomach made the half-mile feel longer than it was, and she accepted a hand up onto the back of his gelding without another word passing between them. The cabin sat low against a rise of land, weathered gray, with a stone chimney at one end and a scattering of outbuildings that had clearly not seen a woman's attention in longer than Ezra would likely admit. A corral stood empty except for 2 horses and a milk cow that eyed them without much interest as they rode in. Inside, the cabin smelled of tallow and old wood smoke, the kind of smell that settles into a place when a man lives alone and does not think to notice it anymore. "It's not much," Ezra said, setting the flour sack on a table that had seen better decades. "But the roof holds, and there's a stove that draws well enough once you learn its temper." Lynn walked the room slowly, taking in the details the way a person does when they are deciding whether a place is safe. There was a rifle above the door, a shelf of dented tins, a wash basin with a crack running halfway across it. But there was also a chair by the window that had been mended with careful stitches of leather, and a quilt on the single bed that showed the pattern of someone's grandmother's hand, faded but whole. "You have kept some things well," she said. "Some things matter more than others." He did not elaborate, and she did not ask. He showed her where the flour and salted pork were kept, where the well stood a short walk from the door, and where she would sleep, a small room off the kitchen that had likely once been meant for storage before he'd put a cot in it instead. He did not linger over the arrangement, did not make it sound like anything other than what it was, but he set a plate in front of her before he did anything else, beans and cornbread from the previous night, and he sat across from her while she ate, as though making certain, without saying so, that she actually would. "You're not from the railroad camps any more," he said eventually. It was not quite a question. The line moved on without me. She kept her eyes on the plate. "There was sickness. I could not travel for many weeks. When I was well again, the camp I had traveled with was 300 miles gone. And since then? Since then, I have been finding what work I can, laundry, mending. When there is no work, there is no food." She set down her fork. "I did not want to steal from that woman's bakery. I want you to know this." "Didn't figure you did." Ezra's voice was even. "Man doesn't need to want a thing to be driven to it." That night, Lynn lay awake in the small room off the kitchen, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a homestead settling into darkness, the creak of the roof cooling, the distant complaint of a coyote somewhere out past the tree line. She did not trust easily, and she trusted men least of all, having learned hard lessons among railroad foremen who mistook her labor for an invitation to something else entirely. But Ezra Hollis had made no such demands. He had shown her the cabin, fed her, and gone to his own bed without a single word that did not concern flour or firewood or the leak in the north wall that would need patching before the fall rains came. She decided, in the dark, that she would stay only as long as it took to save enough coin from whatever small wage he offered to move on to somewhere she might build a life of her own. She did not yet understand that Silver Hollow would not let either of them leave so easily. The trouble began 3 weeks later, on a Sunday when Ezra had ridden into town for supplies, and Lynn had gone with him for the first time since the morning at the bakery. She had proven herself capable in ways that surprised even her, mending the roof herself with materials she found in the barn, coaxing the stove into producing bread that did not scorch, tending the cow in the small garden plot behind the cabin until green things pushed up through soil that had gone neglected for years. Ezra had said little about any of it, but she had noticed the way he ate second helpings now, the way the cabin had begun to smell of bread instead of dust. In town, however, the whispers had not faded. If anything, they had sharpened. "That's Hollis's Chinese woman," someone murmured as they passed the general store, and though the words were not shouted, they carried far enough that Lynn's shoulders drew tight beneath her shawl. The real trouble came from a man named Otis Bramwell, who ran the freight office and had, in recent months, taken to speaking of Ezra's land as though it were already half his own. Bramwell held the note on a stretch of grazing land adjoining Ezra's property, a debt Ezra's late father had signed years before and never fully cleared, and he had made no secret of his interest in seeing that debt called due sooner rather than later. Bramwell stepped into their path outside the mercantile, his coat too fine for the dust of the street, his smile too practiced to be anything but calculated. "Hollis," he said, "and I see you've taken in some help." His eyes moved over Lynn in a way that made her stand straighter, chin lifted, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of his gaze. "Careful now. Folks talk. A man living out there alone with a woman not his wife, and her not even of a kind folks around here are accustomed to seeing kept close, reflects on a fellow's character." "My character's my own business, Otis." Ezra's voice had gone flat and careful. "Same as my land." "For now it is." Bramwell's smile did not waver. "Though I recall your father's note comes due in the spring. Be a shame if a man's reputation made the bank less patient about renewing terms." He walked on without waiting for a reply, and Ezra stood very still for a long moment, his jaw working the way it had in the bakery weeks before. "What did he mean?" Lynn asked quietly. "About the note?" "Means my father borrowed against the land before he died, and I've been paying it down slow ever since. Means Bramwell holds enough sway with the bank that he could make trouble if he wanted to." Ezra shook his head once, sharp. "Don't concern yourself with it." But she did concern herself with it, because she understood better than most what it meant to have your survival dependent on the good opinion of people who had already decided what you were before you'd spoken a single word to them. The garden was Lynn's alone, and it became, over the following weeks, the place where the truth of her began to surface in small pieces. Ezra found her there one evening in early September, kneeling in the rows of beans she had planted, and instead of walking past as he usually did, he sat down on the overturned crate she used as a bench and watched her work in silence for a while. "You're good at this," he said finally. "Better than good." "My grandmother kept a garden in Canton before I was born. My mother after her. I learned before I could read." Lynn sat back on her heels, brushing soil from her hands. "It is strange to find the one thing that feels like home in a place so far from it." "You miss it, Canton." "I miss the idea of it more than the place itself, I think. I was very young when my family left. But there is a smell that comes sometimes, after rain, that takes me back there for a moment, before I remember where I am." She looked at him directly then, something careful loosening in her expression. "You do not ask many questions, Ezra Hollis. Most men, when they learn a person's history, want to know everything at once, as though a life is a story owed to them." "Figure a person tells what they want told, when they want telling it." He turned his hat over once in his hands. "Man who demands the whole of somebody's history in one sitting isn't looking to understand them. He's looking to catalog them, put them somewhere he can make sense of." Something in her chest loosened at that, a tightness she had carried so long she had stopped noticing its weight until it began to ease. "My husband," she said slowly, "died on the crossing from China. Fever on the ship. We had been married 4 months." She had not spoken the words aloud since it happened, not to anyone, not even to herself in the dark of long nights. "I did not tell the railroad foreman. A widow traveling alone invites certain assumptions. It was easier to let them think I had no one to answer to." Ezra did not offer sympathy in the way some men might have, with soft words meant more to comfort themselves than her. He simply nodded, absorbing the weight of what she had told him, and said, "That's a hard thing to carry alone this far from home." "I have carried harder." She resumed her work among the beans. "But thank you for not looking at me as though I am broken by it. Many people do." "Don't see broken when I look at you," he said, and there was something rough in his voice that had not been there before. "See somebody who kept walking when most folks would have sat down in the road and stayed there." They did not speak of it again that evening, but something had shifted in the space between them, a private honesty that neither of them was ready to name outright. The fire came in October, on a night when the wind had been dry and hard for 3 days straight, the kind of wind that made every rancher in the territory nervous about sparks and dry grass. It started in Ezra's hay barn, close enough to midnight that Lynn woke to the smell of smoke before she heard any shouting. She was out of bed and through the cabin door before she had fully understood what was happening, and the sight that met her stole the breath from her chest. Flame had already climbed halfway up the barn's near wall, orange light throwing long shadows across the yard, and Ezra was already running toward it with nothing but a bucket in his hand, and no plan beyond getting the animals out before the roof came down. "The horses!" he shouted, and Lynn ran for the corral without needing to be told twice. The gelding came easily enough, but the second horse, a young mare not yet fully broken to trust, reared and screamed at the smell of smoke, and it was Lynn who managed to calm her, speaking low and steady in the language of her childhood, a language the horse had never heard but seemed somehow to understand as safety rather than threat. She led the mare clear of the barn just as a section of roof gave way behind them in a shower of orange sparks. Ezra emerged from the barn's far door with the milk cow in tow, his shirt scorched at one shoulder, coughing hard from the smoke he'd breathed. Lynn got the animals secured at the far fence line and then turned back toward the fire, grabbing a second bucket from beside the well without thinking twice about the danger of standing so close to a structure that might collapse at any moment. "Get back!" Ezra shouted at her. "I am not leaving you to fight this alone." She threw the water she'd drawn, and it hissed uselessly against flame that had already grown far past what a single bucket could manage. But she kept drawing water anyway, kept throwing it, working alongside him through the worst of the blaze until neighbors from the nearest homestead arrived, roused by the glow against the night sky, and the fight against the fire finally became something closer to even odds. By the time the barn's frame had burned down to blackened bones and the flames had guttered into embers, dawn was beginning to gray the eastern sky. Ezra sat on the ground near the well, exhausted, his hands raw from the buckets and the heat, and Lynn knelt beside him, checking the burn on his shoulder with careful fingers. "This needs tending," she said. "It is not deep, but it will fester if left." "Barn's gone," he said, staring at the ruin. "Winter's coming, and I've got no hay stored and no shelter for the stock." "We will manage it." She said it simply, without drama, the way a person states a fact rather than offers comfort. "I have managed worse with less." He looked at her then, and something in his face had gone open in a way she had not seen before, stripped of its usual careful stillness. "This wasn't an accident," he said quietly. "Wind's been dry, sure, but that fire started in the far corner, near the tack room. Nothing out there to spark on its own." The suggestion sat heavy between them. Neither of them said Bramwell's name aloud, but neither of them needed to. The days that followed the fire were hard ones, filled with the grim work of clearing burned timber and salvaging what could be saved from the wreckage. Lynn worked alongside Ezra without complaint, her hands blistering from the labor, and in the evenings, when the worst of the day's work was done, they sat together on the cabin steps in a silence that had become comfortable rather than strained. It was during one of these evenings that Ezra finally spoke the words that had been building in him since the night of the fire, since long before it, if he was honest with himself. "I've been thinking on something," he said, turning his hat over in his hands the way he did when a thing weighed on him. "This arrangement we've got started out as you needing a place and me needing help around this place, but it's become something else to me somewhere along the way, and I'd be lying if I let you go on thinking otherwise." Lynn went very still. "What are you saying, Ezra Hollis?" "I'm saying I look forward to walking through that door most evenings because I know you'll be on the other side of it. I'm saying the cabin smells like something worth coming home to now, and I don't just mean the bread." He exhaled slowly. "I'm saying I've come to care for you a good deal more than a man ought to care for the woman who cooks his meals, and I'd understand if that's not a thing you're able to hear right now, given all you've lost and all you're still carrying. But I wasn't going to let it go unsaid any longer." Lynn's eyes had gone bright in the lamplight, though she did not let the tears fall. "I did not expect to feel this again," she said softly. "Not after the ship, after my husband. I told myself that part of my life had ended with him." She reached out, and her hand found his, calloused fingers against calloused fingers. "But you have shown me a kindness I did not think I would find again in this country, and it has become something more than gratitude, Ezra. I did not want to name it either, for fear of what it might cost me if I was wrong." "You're not wrong," he said, low. Neither of them moved to close the distance between them that night, some old caution in both of them holding back the final step. But when Ezra reached over and laced his fingers properly through hers, and neither of them let go for a long while after, it was answer enough for both of them. Otis Bramwell came to the homestead himself 2 weeks later, riding up the track in a buggy far too fine for the ruts of a working ranch road, and he did not bother dismounting before he spoke his business. "Heard about your barn, Hollis. Terrible thing. Fire." His voice carried no genuine sympathy at all. "Also heard your note comes due at the bank in 6 weeks' time, and given your current circumstances, I doubt you'll have the capital to clear it. I'm prepared to offer a fair price for the land. Save you the trouble of the bank foreclosing formal." "Land's not for sale," Ezra said. "It will be." Bramwell's eyes flicked toward the cabin, toward Lynn standing in the doorway. "Especially once the bank hears certain particulars about the company you're keeping out here. Man's reputation matters to a lending institution, Hollis, more than you'd think." "You set that fire," Ezra said. It was not a question. Bramwell's smile thinned just slightly, just enough to confirm what neither man would say outright in front of witnesses. That's a serious accusation to make without proof. I'd be careful making it where others might hear." "I've got proof enough," Ezra said, and something in his voice had gone hard and certain in a way Lynn had not heard before. "Freight rope left near the tack room don't belong to me. Belongs to your outfit. Marked plain as anything, if a man knows to look for it. I found it the morning after, tangled in what was left of the wall where the fire started." For the first time, Bramwell's composure cracked, just at the edges. "That proves nothing." "Proves enough for the marshal to ask you some hard questions," Ezra said, "and I intend to see that he does." Bramwell's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked as though he might say something further, might threaten some fresh consequence. But he seemed to think better of it, turning his buggy instead and riding back toward town without another word, the dust of his passage hanging in the air behind him like an unanswered question. "He will not simply let this go," Lynn said, watching the buggy disappear over the rise. "No," Ezra agreed. "Reckon he won't." 2 days later, Bramwell made his move openly, riding into Silver Hollow ahead of the marshal's own investigation and speaking to anyone in town who would listen, painting Ezra as a man whose judgment had been compromised, whose homestead had fallen into disrepute since he'd taken in a woman the town had already decided did not belong there. It was, Lynn understood with a cold clarity, an attempt to poison the well of public opinion before the truth of the fire could surface and clear Ezra's name. To make certain that even if Bramwell was proven guilty of arson, Ezra's reputation would be too damaged for the bank to extend him any further patience regardless. The confrontation that mattered most came at the general store, on a Saturday when half the town had gathered for the weekly delivery of mail and supplies. Bramwell was holding court near the counter, his voice pitched to Carrie, when Lynn walked in beside Ezra, and the room went quiet in the particular way that meant everyone was listening, even while pretending not to. "There she is," Bramwell said, not troubling to lower his voice. "The very woman causing all this trouble. Strange, isn't it, how peaceful this town was before Hollis brought her out here? Fires, scandal, a man's good name dragged through the dirt." Lynn felt the old instinct rise in her, the urge to lower her eyes and retreat, to make herself small enough that his words could not find purchase. But she thought of her grandmother's garden, of the mare calmed by a language it had never heard, of Ezra's hand finding hers in the lamplight, and she did not lower her eyes at all. "You set fire to his barn, Mr. Bramwell," she said, her voice clear and steady enough to carry through the whole of the store. "You did it because you wanted his land and could not have it honestly, and now you stand here trying to make me the reason for troubles you caused yourself, because it is easier to blame a woman who looks different than to answer for what your own hands have done." A murmur went through the gathered townsfolk. Bramwell's face had gone red. "That's a serious accusation from a woman with no standing to make it." "She's got more standing than you'd like to admit," came a new voice from the doorway, and every head in the store turned to see the territorial marshal standing there, dust still on his coat from the ride in. "Found freight rope at the fire site 3 days back. Matches inventory missing from your office ledger, Bramwell. Been asking around town since, and turns out 2 of your own hired men are willing to talk, provided the circuit judge takes a lenient view of their part in it." The color drained from Bramwell's face as thoroughly as it had risen there moments before. "This is absurd. I'll not stand here and be accused by hired liars and a foreign woman with a grudge." "You'll stand wherever the judge tells you to stand, come circuit court in 3 weeks, the marshal said. "For now, I'd suggest you come along with me and we sort the particulars somewhere quieter." The store remained silent as the marshal led Bramwell out, the freight man's protests fading into the street outside. When the door swung shut behind them, the townsfolk who remained looked at Lynn with expressions that had shifted, however slightly, from suspicion toward something closer to reconsideration. It was not forgiveness, not yet, not fully, but it was a beginning, and in a town as small as Silver Hollow, beginnings had a way of growing into something sturdier, given enough seasons to take root. Spring came to the Hollis homestead with a new barn standing where the old one had burned, raised in a single week by neighbors who had come to see the truth of things more clearly than they once had, several of them the very same people who had once whispered about the woman Ezra Hollis kept in his cabin. The bank had extended Ezra's note without further trouble once Bramwell's guilt had been settled by the circuit judge, and Bramwell himself had left the territory entirely rather than face the fuller weight of what the community now knew about him. Lynn's garden had grown wild and abundant through the winter months and into the new season, rows of beans and squash and greens that fed not only the Hollis household, but found their way, in baskets carried to town, into the kitchens of neighbors who had once turned away from her in the street. The bakery, too, had softened toward her, the baker's wife herself stopping by one afternoon with an apology, stiff and awkward but genuine, and an offer to trade flour for the vegetables Lynn no longer needed. On a morning in early June, nearly a year to the day since a loaf of bread had broken apart in Lynn's desperate hands, Ezra found her in the garden again, kneeling among rows that had doubled in size since the previous autumn. He carried something small in his closed fist, and when he knelt beside her in the dirt, he did not seem to notice or care that his good trousers would carry the stain of it. "Got something for you," he said, and opened his hand to reveal a ring, simple, unadorned, fashioned by the territory's one silversmith from coin silver rather than anything grander. "Not much to look at, but I'd be honored if you'd wear it and take my name alongside it, if that's a thing you're willing to consider." Lynn looked at the ring, and then at him, and the tears she had held back on the cabin steps months before finally fell, though her voice remained steady when she spoke. "I did not think I would find this again," she said. "A home. A person who sees me as I am rather than as they wish me to be." She held out her hand. "Yes, Ezra Hollis, I will wear your ring and your name, and I will keep this garden growing beside you for as long as we both are given." They were married the following month by the circuit preacher, in a ceremony small enough to fit the whole of it inside the cabin's front room, with neighbors crowded onto the porch and out into the yard beyond it. The same neighbors who had once eyed Lynn with suspicion, now bringing dishes for a wedding supper that stretched long into the summer evening. The bread that Lynn baked in the years that followed was known throughout Silver Hollow as the finest in the territory, and there was a particular irony in that, one that Ezra liked to mention with a dry note in his voice whenever the subject arose, that the woman once caught stealing a loaf from the town bakery had gone on to bake bread so fine that folks rode out from 3 homesteads over just to trade for it. Lynn would only shake her head at this and remind him that a person's beginning did not have to be their ending, that the measure of a life lay not in where it started, but in what a person chose to build once given the chance to build it. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you kindly for sitting a spell and listening. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you take the time to sit down and hear them out. If you enjoyed what you heard today, go ahead and give that like button a tap. And if you're hungry for more stories from the old frontier, consider subscribing so you don't miss whatever comes next. Until then, take good care of yourself, and thank you again for spending this time with me.